Genesis chapter 11 verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language, and of one speech. Context: Genesis chapter 11 marks an important event in human history known as the Tower of Babel. Prior to this event, humanity had spread across the earth following the flood during the time of Noah. In Genesis chapter 10, the table of nations lists the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 sets the stage for the narrative that follows. Unity of language and speech. In this verse, it states that the whole earth had one language and one speech. This indicates a sense of unity and commonality among the people. They were able to communicate effectively and understand one another without barriers caused by language differences. This unity is significant as it sets the backdrop for the events that unfold in the subsequent verses. Significance of language. Language is a powerful tool that enables communication and understanding among individuals and communities. In this context, the unity of language allowed people to work together and collaborate more easily. It promoted a sense of harmony and shared purpose. This linguistic unity had a significant impact on the development of human civilization at that time. The purpose of unity. While the verse does not explicitly state the purpose of the unity of language, it implies that the people were able to cooperate effectively. It suggests that they had the potential to accomplish great things together. However, as we continue reading the subsequent verses in Genesis chapter 11, we discover that the people's unity and ambition took a wrong turn, leading to divine intervention. Lessons and application. Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 reminds us of the importance of unity and effective communication. When people are united and able to understand one another, they can achieve remarkable feats. However, it also warns against the dangers of unchecked ambition and the misuse of unity. The subsequent events in the Tower of Babel narrative highlight the consequences of human pride and rebellion against God's purposes. Furthermore, this verse can prompt us to reflect on our own use of language and communication. We should strive for unity, understanding, and cooperation in our interactions with others. Additionally, it serves as a reminder to be cautious and discerning about how we use the power of language, ensuring that our ambitions align with God's will and purposes. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 highlights the unity of language and speech among the people of that time. It sets the stage for the events that follow and carries important lessons about the power of language, unity, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Genesis chapter 11 verse 2. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. This verse is part of the account of the Tower of Babel, which is found in Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 to 9. To fully understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the context and the key themes present in this passage. Historical context. After the flood described in Genesis chapter 6 verse 9, humanity began to multiply and spread across the earth. The people migrated eastward and settled in a plain in the land of Shinar. It is believed that Shinar corresponds to the region of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the southern part of present-day Iraq. Unity and disobedience. The people who settled in Shinar were united in their language and purpose. In verse 4, they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Their desire was to build a city and a tower that would reach the heavens as a symbol of their own greatness. This unity, however, was not in line with God's plan for humanity. Human pride and rebellion. The construction of the Tower of Babel was motivated by human pride and rebellion against God's command to fill the earth. The people's intention to make a name for themselves and prevent being scattered across the earth was in direct contradiction to God's earlier command given to Noah and his descendants to multiply and fill the earth. Genesis chapter 9 verse 1. Divine intervention. Recognizing the people's rebellious intent and their potential for even greater defiance, God intervened. In Genesis chapter 11 verses 7 to 8, it is written, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. God confused their languages, leading to the formation of various distinct languages and groups. As a result, they were scattered across the earth as God had originally intended. Symbolism and lessons. The story of the Tower of Babel serves as a cautionary tale and carries important lessons for humanity. It highlights the dangers of pride, disobedience, and the consequences of pursuing one's own glory instead of aligning with God's will. The scattering of languages also demonstrates the power of God to intervene in human affairs when necessary. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 2 is a part of the account of the Tower of Babel, which depicts humanity's rebellion and pride in building a city and a tower to make a name for themselves. God intervened by confusing their language and scattering them across the earth. This story reminds us of the importance of humility, obedience, and aligning ourselves with God's purposes rather than pursuing our own glory. Genesis chapter 11 verse 3. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. This verse is part of the account of the Tower of Babel, which occurs in Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 to verse 9. Let's explore the context and meaning of this verse within the broader narrative. The story of the Tower of Babel takes place after the Great Flood and focuses on the descendants of Noah. In Genesis chapter 10, the chapter immediately preceding the Tower of Babel account, a genealogy is given, tracing the lineages of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This genealogy provides a backdrop for understanding the subsequent events. In Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 to verse 2, we read that all the people on earth spoke the same language and migrated from the east, settling in a plain in the land of Shinar, Babylonia. They decided to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens. The people wanted to make a name for themselves and prevent themselves from being scattered across the earth. Verse 3 describes the people's plan to build the tower. They said to one another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. The people decided to make bricks instead of using stones, which would have been a more readily available building material. They intended to burn the bricks thoroughly to increase their strength and durability. Additionally, the verse mentions that they used slime, or bitumen, as mortar to bind the bricks together. This verse serves as an introduction to the construction process employed by the people of Babel. It highlights their technological advancements and determination to build a towering structure that would reach the heavens. The Tower of Babel account carries significant theological themes. It showcases humanity's attempt to assert its power and greatness apart from God's guidance and authority. The people sought to make a name for themselves and establish a centralized city to prevent being scattered across the earth. In their arrogance, they wanted to build a tower that would reach the heavens, defying the boundaries set by God. The consequences of their actions are revealed in the following verses. God observes their unity and ambition and decides to confuse their language. As a result, the people are unable to understand one another, leading to the dispersion of humanity across the earth. The tower remains unfinished, and the city is called Babel, which means confusion in Hebrew. This account serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, disobedience, and self-centeredness. It highlights the importance of acknowledging God's sovereignty and submitting to His will rather than pursuing our own desires and ambitions apart from Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 3 describes the building materials and techniques used by the people of Babel in their construction of the Tower of Babel. The verse sets the stage for the account of the Tower of Babel, which warns against human pride and rebellion against God. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 to 9 describes the story of the Tower of Babel. After the flood, humanity multiplied and settled in the land of Shinar. As they journeyed eastward, they decided to build a city and a tower to make a name for themselves. Unity and pride. The people's desire to build a city and a tower indicates their unity and shared purpose. However, their motivation reveals a prideful ambition. They wanted to make a name for themselves, seeking fame and significance. This ambition was rooted in human self-exaltation rather than glorifying God. Reaching to heaven. The people desired to build a tower that would reach unto heaven. This aspiration can be understood metaphorically rather than as a physical attempt to reach the abode of God. The tower represented human efforts to elevate themselves to divine status or challenge God's authority. Scattered abroad, the people were concerned about being scattered across the earth. This fear may have been influenced by the memory of the flood and the subsequent dispersion of humanity. They sought to establish a centralized city and tower to prevent further scattering and maintain the unity. Divine response. Genesis chapter 11 verses 5-9 describes how God responded to their actions. Recognizing the pride and rebellion in their hearts, God confused their language, resulting in the people being unable to understand one another. As a consequence, they abandoned the construction project, and God scattered them across the earth, giving rise to different languages and nations. Lessons and applications. Pride and self-exaltation are contrary to God's will. The Tower of Babel serves as a cautionary tale against the dangers of human arrogance and attempts to challenge God's authority. Unity should be centered on God, not on self-glorification. True unity is found in honoring and obeying God, rather than seeking personal fame or achievements. God's sovereignty and authority cannot be undermined. Regardless of humanity's efforts, God remains supreme, and any attempt to exalt oneself above God will ultimately fail. Language barriers and cultural diversity are part of God's design. God's scattering of humanity resulted in the development of different languages and nations, reflecting His desire for diverse expressions of culture and community. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 teaches us about the dangers of human pride, the importance of unity centered on God, and the reminder of God's sovereignty. It encourages us to humbly submit to God's will and recognize His authority in all aspects of our lives. Genesis chapter 11 verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. This verse is part of the account of the Tower of Babel, which describes an event that took place after the flood during the time when the whole earth had one language and one speech. Here's a breakdown of the key elements and themes present in this verse. Human ambition. Genesis chapter 11 verse 4 states that the people of the earth desired to build a city and a tower that would reach the heavens. This ambition reveals a collective human effort to make a name for themselves and establish a center of power and influence. It signifies the pride and self-reliance of humanity. Divine observation. The verse tells us that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. This anthropomorphic language portrays God's response to humanity's endeavors. Although God is omniscient and fully aware of all things, this language conveys His involvement and intervention in human affairs. Limitations of humanity. By coming down to see what was happening, God demonstrated His authority and power over all creation. The tower that humans built was an attempt to reach the heavens and assert their own greatness. However, God's observation reminds us of the limitations of human achievement and the supremacy of the divine. God's response. The Tower of Babel incident highlights God's response to human pride and self-sufficiency. In the following verses, Genesis chapter 11 verse 6-9, God confuses their language, scatters the people, and disrupts their unified plan. This act humbles the people, preventing them from carrying out their grandiose ambitions. God's response serves as a reminder that our endeavors must align with His will and purposes. Themes of humility and dependence. The Tower of Babel narrative teaches us important lessons about humility and dependence on God. It reveals the futility of human efforts to exalt ourselves and emphasizes the need to acknowledge our limitations. Instead of relying solely on our own abilities, we are called to seek and align ourselves with God's will. Cultural and linguistic diversity. The scattering of people and the confusion of languages at Babel led to the diversification of human cultures and languages across the earth. This event helps to explain the origin of different languages and the subsequent development of distinct nations and civilizations. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 5 provides a glimpse into the Tower of Babel's story, illustrating the pride and ambitions of humanity, God's response to human self-reliance, and the resulting consequences. This verse invites us to reflect on the importance of humility, dependence on God, and the recognition of His ultimate authority over our lives. Genesis chapter 11 verse 6. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. This verse is part of the narrative of the Tower of Babel, which takes place after the Great Flood. The people of the earth, speaking one language, gathered in the land of Shinar and decided to build a city with a tower that would reach to heaven. In response to their actions, God intervenes and confuses their languages, scattering them across the earth. Let's explore the significance and lessons we can draw from Genesis chapter 11 verse 6. Unity and cooperation. The verse begins by acknowledging the unity and cohesion of the people. They had one language and were working together toward a common goal. This highlights the power of unity and cooperation when people come together for a shared purpose. Human potential. God recognizes the immense potential of humanity when they are united. The verse states, "Nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." This indicates that with their combined efforts and shared vision, there were no limits to what they could achieve. Pride and rebellion. The people's desire to build a tower reaching to heaven can be seen as an act of pride and rebellion against God. It was a demonstration of their self-sufficiency and an attempt to make a name for themselves. This passage serves as a cautionary reminder about the dangers of excessive pride and rebellion against God's authority. Divine intervention. God observes the people's actions and decides to intervene. By confusing their language and scattering them across the earth, God disrupts their plans and prevents their unity from leading to further rebellion. This shows God's sovereignty and His ability to thwart human plans when they go against His divine purposes. The consequences of disunity, the scattering of people and the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel led to the formation of different nations and languages. This event serves as an explanation for the diversity of languages and cultures across the world. It also highlights the consequences of disunity and the breakdown of communication among people. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 6 reveals the power of human unity and cooperation, as well as the potential dangers of pride and rebellion. It emphasizes God's sovereignty and His ability to intervene in human affairs. The Tower of Babel story teaches us about the importance of humility, obedience to God, and the consequences of division and miscommunication. Genesis chapter 11 verse 7. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Context. Genesis chapter 11 verse 7 is part of the story of the Tower of Babel. The people of the earth had gathered together in one place and began building a tower to make a name for themselves and prevent their dispersion. However, this act of rebellion against God's command led to God confusing their language and scattering them across the earth. Divine intervention. In this verse, God declares, "Let us go down." This phrase implies that it was a divine intervention in response to the human rebellion. God chose to personally intervene and address the situation. Confounding of language. God's purpose in confusing their language was to hinder their ability to communicate effectively. By doing so, God prevented their unified efforts in building the tower and seeking their own glory. The diversity of languages would ultimately lead to their dispersion and the formation of different nations and cultures. God's sovereignty. The verse reveals God's sovereignty and authority over human affairs. He is aware of the actions of humanity, and He has the power to intervene and disrupt their plans when they go against His will. God's intervention at the Tower of Babel demonstrated His control over the destiny of nations and His ability to accomplish His purposes. Consequences of disobedience. The confusion of languages and the subsequent scattering of people across the earth were the consequences of human disobedience. It serves as a reminder that when humans rebel against God and seek their own glory, there are repercussions. God's actions in response to the Tower of Babel event emphasize the importance of obedience and humility before Him. Unity in diversity. The scattering of people and the creation of diverse languages highlight the importance of embracing diversity. While the division of languages caused confusion and hindered cooperation at Babel, we can see throughout the Bible that God's ultimate plan is to bring people from every tribe, language, and nation together in unity through Jesus Christ. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 7 reveals God's response to the rebellion at the Tower of Babel. His intervention through the confusion of languages highlights His sovereignty, the consequences of disobedience, and the importance of embracing diversity while pursuing unity in Christ. Genesis chapter 11 verse 8. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verses 1-9 recounts the story of the Tower of Babel. After the flood in Noah's time, the descendants of Noah's sons populated the earth. As they migrated eastward, they settled in a plain called Shinar and decided to build a city in the tower that would reach the heavens. Their intention was to make a name for themselves and prevent being scattered across the earth. The rebellion and pride of humanity. The people's desire to build a tower reaching the heavens was not necessarily an architectural feat but rather a symbol of their arrogance and defiance against God. It displayed their rebellion and desire for self-sufficiency, seeking glory for themselves rather than acknowledging God's sovereignty. Their actions were driven by pride and a disregard for God's authority. God's response. In response to the people's rebellious intentions, God intervened by confounding their language. He scattered them across the earth, preventing them from communicating and collaborating effectively. By dispersing them, God accomplished two primary purposes: humbling humankind. God's actions humbled the people and demonstrated their limitations. Their inability to communicate effectively hindered their ambitious project and demonstrated their dependence on God's grace. Preserving His plan. God's plan was for humanity to fill the earth and not be confined to a centralized location. The people's rebellion and desire to create a centralized power structure threatened God's intended design. By scattering them, God ensured His original plan would be fulfilled. Lessons and applications. Humility and God's authority. The story of the Tower of Babel reminds us of the importance of humility before God. It cautions against the dangers of pride, self-sufficiency, and rebellion. Recognizing God's authority and submitting to His will is crucial for a healthy and righteous relationship with Him. God's sovereignty and purpose. Genesis chapter 11 verse 8 emphasizes God's sovereignty and His ability to intervene in human affairs. It reveals that God's plans and purposes supersede human ambitions. We should align our lives with God's will and trust His guidance rather than pursuing our own agendas. Unity and communication. The confusion of languages resulted in the dispersion of people across the earth. This incident highlights the significance of effective communication and unity among individuals and communities. As believers, we are called to foster unity, understanding, and cooperation among diverse groups, while maintaining our focus on God's purposes. God's faithfulness and preservation. Despite human rebellion, God remained faithful to His promises and His plan to bless all nations through Abraham and his descendants. The scattering of the people ultimately served to fulfill God's purpose, demonstrating His providence and faithfulness throughout history. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 8 illustrates God's response to human rebellion at the Tower of Babel. It teaches us lessons on humility, God's sovereignty, the importance of effective communication and unity, and God's faithfulness in preserving His plans. Genesis chapter 11 verse 9. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Genesis chapter 11 verse 9 is part of the story commonly known as the Tower of Babel. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to examine the broader context of the passage. The Tower of Babel account is found in Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 to 9. It takes place after the Great Flood and the genealogy of Noah's descendants. At this time, the whole earth had one language and a common speech. People migrated from the east and settled in a plain in the land of Shinar, which is Babylonia. In their unity and ambition, the people decided to build a city and a tower that would reach the heavens. They intended to make a name for themselves and prevent their dispersion across the earth. The construction of this tower was an act of human pride and rebellion against God's command to multiply and fill the earth, Genesis chapter 9 verse 1. In response to their arrogance, God intervened by confusing their language. As a result, people were unable to understand one another, leading to the formation of various languages. The name of the city, Babel, is associated with the confusion of languages, as it sounds similar to the Hebrew word Balal, meaning to confuse or to mix. The scattering of people throughout the earth due to the confusion of languages serves as a form of divine punishment. God's intention was to prevent humanity from concentrating their efforts in one place and becoming a unified force for evil. By dispersing them, God restrained the progress of their rebellious ambitions. The Tower of Babel narrative carries several important theological themes. Firstly, it highlights the consequences of human pride and rebellion against God's will. The Genesis chapter 11 verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old, and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Historical context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 is part of the early narrative of the book of Genesis that deals with the period following the Great Flood. The account of the Tower of Babel, which precedes this verse, explains how humanity became divided into different languages and dispersed across the earth. Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 marks a shift in focus from the whole of humanity to the specific genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons. Shem and the generations. Shem, Noah's eldest son, is mentioned as the ancestor of a specific lineage. The term generations refers to the descendants or genealogy of Shem. This concept is significant in the book of Genesis as it establishes a pattern of tracing the lineage of the chosen people through specific individuals. Shem's age and son. According to the verse, Shem was 100 years old when he became the father of Arphaxad. It is noteworthy that Shem's son, Arphaxad, was born just 2 years after the flood. This indicates that the lineage of Shem begins relatively soon after the global catastrophe, emphasizing the continuity of human existence and the fulfillment of God's plan for humanity despite the judgment of the flood. The significance of Arphaxad, the son of Shem, is an important figure in biblical genealogy. He is mentioned in the genealogical lists found in Genesis chapter 10 and chapter 11, and his descendants are traced to the patriarch Abraham, establishing a crucial link in the lineage of the Israelites and, ultimately, Jesus Christ. The faithfulness of God's promise. The mention of Shem's genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 reminds readers of God's faithfulness to his promises. After the flood, God had made a covenant with Noah, Genesis chapter 9 verse 8 to verse 17, ensuring the preservation of humanity and establishing a divine plan for redemption. The mention of Shem's descendants reaffirms God's faithfulness and his commitment to fulfilling his promises. Foreshadowing salvation history. The genealogy recorded in Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 is part of the broader narrative of salvation history found in the Bible. The lineage traced from Shem eventually leads to the Israelites, who become God's chosen people. Through this lineage, God's redemptive plan for humanity unfolds, culminating in the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who brings salvation to all. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 serves as a transitional verse in the book of Genesis, shifting the focus from the global perspective to the specific lineage of Shem. It highlights the faithfulness of God's promises and sets the stage for the unfolding of salvation history. Genesis chapter 11 verse 11. And Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years, and begat sons and daughters. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 11 is a verse from the book of Genesis, which provides an account of human history from creation to the time of the patriarchs. This specific verse is part of the genealogy that traces the descendants of Noah's son, Shem, after the flood. Shem's lifespan. The verse begins by stating that Shem lived for 500 years after he fathered Arphaxad. Shem was one of the 3 sons of Noah and played a significant role in biblical history. He was a righteous man who, along with his family, was saved from the great flood by entering the ark. The significance of genealogy. The genealogies found in the Bible serve several purposes. Firstly, they provide historical records of the descendants of specific individuals or groups. Secondly, they establish lineages and family connections, which were crucial in ancient Hebrew culture for matters such as inheritance and tribal affiliation. Lastly, genealogies often highlight key figures in God's redemptive plan, pointing towards the fulfillment of prophecies and the eventual arrival of the Messiah. The fulfillment of God's promises. The genealogy recorded in Genesis chapter 11 is significant because it leads up to the birth of Abram, later called Abraham, in Genesis chapter 11 verse 26. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising to make him a great nation and bless all the families of the earth through him. Genesis chapter 12 verse 2 through 3. The genealogy helps establish the lineage through which God would fulfill his promises. Spiritual lessons. While Genesis chapter 11 verse 11 may seem like a simple statement of Shem's extended lifespan and the fact that he had children, it reminds us of the faithfulness and sovereignty of God. It highlights the continuation of God's plan and the preservation of the godly line through Shem. It is a reminder that God works through generations, unfolding his purposes according to his perfect timing. Application. As we read through genealogical records in the Bible, we can be encouraged by the faithfulness of God in preserving his people and fulfilling his promises. It reminds us of the importance of our own spiritual heritage and the role we play in passing on our faith to future generations. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 11 is a verse that provides a brief account of Shem's life and the continuation of God's plan through his descendants. It reminds us of the faithfulness of God in preserving his people and fulfilling his promises. Genesis chapter 11 verse 12. And Arphaxad lived 35 years, and begat Salah. Context. Genesis chapter 11 is a chapter that describes the genealogy of Shem, the son of Noah, after the flood. This chapter lists the descendants of Shem, tracing their lineage from generation to generation. Arphaxad. Arphaxad was one of the sons of Shem, and he was born after the flood. He is mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 verse 22 as well. Arphaxad's name often appears in biblical genealogies, as he became an ancestor of many important figures, including Abraham, who is considered the father of the Israelite nation. Arphaxad's age and son. According to Genesis chapter 11 verse 12, Arphaxad lived for 35 years and then became the father of Salah. This verse indicates the passing of time and the continuation of the lineage of Shem. Symbolism and significance. The genealogies in the Bible hold both historical and symbolic significance. While on the surface, this verse may seem like a simple record of generations, it contributes to the larger narrative of God's plan for redemption and the fulfillment of his promises. Continuity of God's plan. The inclusion of Arphaxad's name and the mention of Salah emphasize the continuity of God's plan from generation to generation. God's promise to bless all nations through Abraham, Genesis chapter 12 verse 3, and his redemptive plan to bring salvation through Jesus Christ, Galatians chapter 3 verse 16, are rooted in the genealogy traced back to Arphaxad. Faithfulness and providence. This verse serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. Even though the names listed in genealogies may seem insignificant to us, they demonstrate God's providential guidance in preserving the chosen line through which the Messiah would eventually come. Spiritual lessons. While this verse may not have an explicit spiritual lesson, it reminds us of the importance of faithfulness in our own lives. Just as God remained faithful to His covenant promises throughout history, we are called to trust in His faithfulness and walk in obedience, knowing that He is working out His plans even in the midst of seemingly mundane or ordinary circumstances. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 12 highlights the continuation of Shem's lineage through the birth of Arphaxad's son, Salah. While this verse may appear as a small detail, it contributes to the larger narrative of God's faithfulness, providence, and His plan for redemption through Jesus Christ. Genesis chapter 11 verse 13. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years, and begat sons and daughters. Context: the verse is part of the genealogy in Genesis chapter 11, which traces the lineage from Noah to Abram, later renamed Abraham. This genealogy highlights the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons. The specific verse focuses on Arphaxad, who was a son of Shem and the father of Salah. Arphaxad's life: the verse states that Arphaxad lived for 403 years after he fathered Salah. It is important to note that in the genealogical accounts of the Old Testament, the emphasis is primarily on tracing the lineage and highlighting the progression of generations. Historical and spiritual significance: Arphaxad's significance lies in his inclusion within the genealogy leading to Abraham. Abraham plays a crucial role in the biblical narrative as the father of the Hebrew people and the one through whom God establishes His covenant. Therefore, tracing the line from Arphaxad to Abraham is significant in establishing the historical and spiritual lineage of God's chosen people. Numerical symbolism: some scholars interpret the numbers in genealogies symbolically. In this case, the number 403 may not represent an exact literal lifespan but rather hold symbolic meaning. For example, 400 can symbolize a period of trial or testing, while 3 can symbolize divine perfection. Thus, this verse might signify a period of preparation or testing before the next significant event in the genealogy. Lessons for today: while this verse may not provide specific lessons or teachings in and of itself, it reminds us of the importance of genealogies in the biblical narrative. The genealogies serve to connect different generations, emphasize God's faithfulness in preserving a chosen line of people, and ultimately point to the fulfillment of His promises in Jesus Christ. Overall, Genesis chapter 11 verse 13 serves as a bridge in the genealogy, tracing the lineage from Arphaxad to Salah, and contributes to the unfolding narrative of God's plan for humanity. Genesis chapter 11 verse 14. And Salah lived 30 years, and begat Eber. This verse is part of the genealogical account found in the book of Genesis, specifically in the section known as the Table of Nations. It provides a record of the descendants of Noah after the flood and traces the lineage from Shem, one of Noah's sons, to Abram, later known as Abraham, who plays a significant role in the biblical narrative. In the context of Genesis chapter 11 verse 14, Salah is mentioned as the son of Arphaxad and the father of Eber. The genealogy serves as a bridge between the genealogical lists provided in Genesis chapter 10 and the subsequent narrative that focuses on the story of Abraham and the establishment of the nation of Israel. Salah was the son of Arphaxad, who was a descendant of Shem, the son of Noah. His name means sprout or branch. According to the biblical account, Salah lived for 433 years, Genesis chapter 11 verse 15. Eber was the son of Salah and the father of Peleg. Eber's name is associated with the Hebrews, which is another name for the Israelites. The term Hebrew is derived from Eber's name, as he is considered to be an ancestor of the Hebrew people. The significance of this verse lies in the continuation of the genealogy leading up to Abraham. From a broader perspective, it emphasizes the unfolding of God's plan to bring forth a chosen people through whom He would reveal Himself to the world. These genealogies serve as a historical record, tracing the lineage from the flood to the eventual establishment of the nation of Israel and the arrival of the promised Messiah. It is important to note that while genealogies may not always carry extensive theological or spiritual teachings within individual verses, they contribute to the overall narrative and provide historical context for understanding the biblical account. Genesis chapter 11 verse 15. And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years, and begat sons and daughters. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 15 is part of the genealogy mentioned in the account of the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's sons. This genealogy lists the generations from Shem to Abram, later known as Abraham. Salah is the son of Arphaxad, who is the son of Shem. This verse provides information about Salah's life and descendants. Salah's lifespan. The verse states that Salah lived for 403 years after he became the father of Eber. This emphasizes the long lifespans of the early patriarchs mentioned in the genealogies in Genesis. It also provides a chronological marker for understanding the timeline of events in early biblical history. The significance of Eber. Eber is mentioned as one of the sons of Salah. The name Eber means the other side, or across. Eber is significant because his name is associated with the Hebrew people. It is from the name Eber that the term Hebrew is derived, and he is considered an ancestor of the Hebrews, including Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel. Family and descendants. The verse also mentions that Salah had other sons and daughters. Though the specific names and details of his other children are not provided here, this verse indicates that Salah had a significant family, and his descendants likely contributed to the growth of the human population at that time. Spiritual lessons. While this verse primarily focuses on the genealogical details, we can draw a few spiritual lessons from it. First, the genealogies in the Bible remind us of the historical and genealogical continuity of God's plan for redemption. The mention of names and lifespans shows how God works through generations and fulfills his purposes over time. Second, the mention of Eber as the ancestor of the Hebrews reminds us of God's choice of a specific people through whom he would bring forth the Messiah, Jesus Christ. It highlights God's sovereignty in selecting and preserving a lineage that would play a crucial role in salvation history. Lastly, this verse serves as a reminder that God values family and the continuity of generations. Each person mentioned in the genealogies had a role to play in God's plan, even if their specific contributions are not highlighted in the biblical narrative. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 15 provides information about Salah's lifespan, his son Eber, and the existence of his other sons and daughters. It contributes to the overall genealogical account in the Bible, reminding us of God's faithfulness and his plan for redemption through the generations. Genesis chapter 11 verse 16. And Eber lived 34 years, and begat Peleg. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 16 is part of the genealogical account found in the early chapters of Genesis. It follows the narrative of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 to verse 9, where mankind sought to build a tower to reach the heavens, but God confused their language and scattered them across the earth. Eber. The verse begins with the mention of Eber. Eber was a descendant of Shem, who was one of Noah's sons. The Hebrew word Eber means beyond, or cross over, which might indicate that his descendants would eventually settle beyond the land of Canaan. Lifespan and descendants. The verse states that Eber lived for 34 years and then had a son named Peleg. This verse is notable because it marks the beginning of the lineage that will lead to Abraham, the father of the Israelite nation. Peleg's name means division or splitting, which is significant because in the following chapter, Genesis chapter 11 verse 17 to verse 26, the narrative explains that during Peleg's lifetime, the earth was divided into different language groups. Historical significance. The genealogies recorded in Genesis serve as a historical framework, tracing the lineage of God's chosen people. In this verse, Eber's descendants, including Peleg, will become part of the line that leads to Abraham, and eventually to Jesus Christ, fulfilling God's plan of redemption for humanity. Spiritual lessons. While this verse may appear to be a simple genealogical record, it teaches us several spiritual lessons. Firstly, It reminds us that God works through specific individuals and family lines to accomplish His purposes. Eber and Peleg play crucial roles in the unfolding of God's plan for humanity. Additionally, it emphasizes God's sovereignty in dividing humanity and shaping the course of history. The scattering of the people at the Tower of Babel highlights God's power to frustrate human pride and assert His divine will. Overall, Genesis chapter 11 verse 16 provides a brief but important glimpse into the genealogy leading to Abraham and lays the foundation for the unfolding of God's redemptive plan for mankind. It reminds us of God's sovereignty in shaping history and the significance of key individuals in fulfilling His purposes. Genesis chapter 11 verse 17. Thus were the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Genesis chapter 11 verse 17 is part of the broader narrative of the Tower of Babel, which describes a significant event that occurred after the flood. To fully understand the context of this verse, let's explore the preceding verses and the overall story. In Genesis chapter 11, we find that humanity had become increasingly unified in purpose and language. The people of the earth decided to settle in the land of Shinar and began building a city and a tower, intending to make a name for themselves and prevent their dispersion across the earth. Their motive seems to have been driven by pride and a desire for self-exaltation. However, God, who sees their intentions and actions, decides to intervene. In verse 6, the Lord says, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." Recognizing the potential for their unified strength to be misused, God confuses their language, causing them to speak different tongues. Consequently, they are unable to understand one another and continue their construction project. Genesis chapter 11 verse 17 signifies the aftermath of the Tower of Babel incident and the dispersion of people into different nations and languages. This verse reminds us that the families of the sons of Noah, namely Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the source of the various nations that arose on the earth following the flood. This verse highlights a key theme in the book of Genesis and throughout the Bible: the diversity of humanity. It emphasizes the fact that God's plan for humanity involved spreading them across the earth and establishing distinct nations. The Tower of Babel incident was a significant event that not only resulted in linguistic diversity but also contributed to the development of distinct cultures and nations. The dispersion of people into different nations and the development of various languages was a crucial step in fulfilling God's purposes for humanity. It allowed for the fulfillment of God's command in Genesis chapter 9 verse 7, where He said to Noah and his sons, "Be fruitful, and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it." The dispersion ensured the spread and multiplication of humanity across the earth. Furthermore, this event also highlights the consequences of human pride and the need for humility. The people of Babel sought to make a name for themselves and exalt themselves above God's plan. However, God intervened to remind them of their dependence on Him and to direct their paths according to His purposes. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 17 serves as a summary statement of the dispersion of humanity into different nations and languages after the Tower of Babel incident. It underscores the diversity of humanity and the fulfillment of God's plan to spread them across the earth. It also teaches us about the consequences of human pride and the importance of humility in aligning ourselves with God's purposes. Genesis chapter 11 verse 18. And Peleg lived 30 years, and begat Reu. Context. To understand Genesis chapter 11 verse 18, it's important to consider the broader context. Genesis chapter 11 describes the events following the flood and the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The genealogy leading up to Peleg is recorded in Genesis chapter 10 verse 25, which mentions the division of the earth during the days of Peleg. Meaning of names. Peleg's name means division or division of the earth. It becomes significant in understanding the events associated with his time. Reu was Peleg's son. The name Reu means friend or companion. The significance of Peleg. Genesis chapter 11 verse 18 highlights the birth of Peleg, marking an important transition in human history. It sets the stage for the subsequent events that take place during his lifetime. The primary significance of Peleg is associated with the division of the earth. Division of the earth. Genesis chapter 10 verse 25 states, "And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided." This division of the earth is commonly understood as a reference to the scattering of people across different regions and the formation of various language groups. The event described here is often associated with the Tower of Babel account, which follows in the subsequent verses. Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 to 9. Historical and theological implications. The division of the earth during the days of Peleg carries historical and theological implications. Historically, it explains the diversity of languages and the dispersion of people groups across different regions. Theologically, it serves as a significant event in God's plan for humanity, as it reflects His judgment on human pride and disobedience displayed at the Tower of Babel. Lessons and applications. Humility before God. The story of the Tower of Babel reminds us of the importance of humility before God. It cautions against human pride and the desire for self-glorification, emphasizing the need to acknowledge and submit to God's authority. God's sovereignty. The division of the earth highlights God's sovereignty and His ability to shape human history according to His purposes. It demonstrates that no human effort can thwart God's plans or establish itself independently of Him. Unity in diversity. The scattering of people across different regions and the formation of various language groups reminds us of the beauty of diversity. It teaches us to appreciate and respect different cultures, languages, and ethnicities while fostering unity in the common bond of humanity. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 18 introduces Peleg, whose name signifies the division of the earth. This division refers to the scattering of people and the formation of diverse language groups. The event serves as a historical and theological reminder of humility before God, His sovereignty, and the importance of unity in diversity. Genesis chapter 11 verse 19. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years, and begat sons and daughters. This verse is part of the genealogy listed in the book of Genesis, tracing the lineage from Adam to the generations after the Great Flood. In this specific verse, the focus is on a descendant named Peleg. Peleg was the son of Eber and the great-great-grandson of Shem, who was one of Noah's 3 sons. The name Peleg means division or earthquake. According to the biblical account, Peleg lived for a total of 239 years, during which he had sons and daughters. Although this verse may seem relatively straightforward and lacking significant narrative content, it provides us with important genealogical information within the context of the biblical narrative. The genealogies in the book of Genesis help establish the lineage leading up to the main characters and events in the Old Testament. It is worth noting that some interpretations suggest that the mention of Peleg's name, meaning division, may be connected to the account of the Tower of Babel, which is described in the preceding verses of Genesis chapter 11. The Tower of Babel story describes how the people of that time sought to build a tower that would reach the heavens, but God confused their languages and scattered them across the earth. Given the proximity of the mention of Peleg to the Tower of Babel account, some theologians and scholars speculate that Peleg's name may symbolize the division or scattering of humanity as a result of God's intervention at Babel. However, this connection is not explicitly stated in the verse itself and remains a subject of interpretation. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 19 is a verse within the genealogical record of the book of Genesis, specifically focusing on Peleg, his lifespan, and his descendants. While its primary purpose is to establish the family lineage, it also offers potential connections to the narrative of the Tower of Babel and the division of humanity. Genesis chapter 11 verse 20. And Reu lived 32 years, and begat Serug. This verse is part of the genealogy recorded in the book of Genesis, specifically in the chapter commonly known as the Table of Nations or the Generations of Shem. This chapter lists the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons, after the flood. It provides a historical account of the generations that followed after the Tower of Babel incident. In this particular verse, the focus is on Reu, who was a descendant of Shem. It states that Reu lived for 32 years and then became the father of Serug. It is important to note that genealogies in the Bible serve multiple purposes. They establish a lineage of people and can help trace family trees, but they also serve as a means of establishing historical and theological connections. In this case, the genealogy is significant because it traces the ancestry from Shem to Abraham, who played a crucial role in the biblical narrative as the father of the Hebrew people. While this specific verse may not appear to convey a profound spiritual or theological message on its own, it contributes to the larger narrative of God's plan for humanity. The genealogical accounts in the Bible often highlight God's faithfulness in preserving the chosen line leading to the fulfillment of His promises. It underscores the continuity and providence of God throughout history, as He worked through specific individuals and their descendants to accomplish His purposes. By studying the larger context of Genesis chapter 11 and the subsequent chapters, we gain a deeper understanding of God's unfolding plan for humanity, His faithfulness, and His sovereignty in orchestrating events. It reminds us of the importance of recognizing God's hand in history and our place within His larger redemptive story. Genesis chapter 11 verse 21. And Reu lived after he begat Serug 207 years, and begat sons and daughters. This verse is a part of the genealogical account in the book of Genesis, specifically in the lineage of Shem, one of Noah's sons. It provides information about the descendants of Shem and their respective lifespans. Reu was the son of Peleg and the great-grandson of Shem. According to the biblical account, he lived for a total of 207 years after the birth of his son Serug. Reu is also mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, Luke chapter 3 verse 35 to 36. Serug was the son of Reu and the father of Nahor. The Bible doesn't provide much information about Serug apart from his inclusion in the genealogical records. This verse primarily serves to establish the genealogical line leading up to Abraham, who plays a significant role in God's plan of salvation and the establishment of the nation of Israel. The genealogies in the Bible not only trace the lineage of individuals but also help establish historical continuity and demonstrate God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. While this verse may not contain explicit teachings or moral lessons, it is an integral part of the biblical narrative and contributes to our understanding of the historical context and the unfolding of God's plan throughout generations. It's important to note that Bible study involves a comprehensive examination of the Scriptures, considering the broader context, cultural background, and theological themes. Thus, exploring adjacent verses and the overall message of the book of Genesis can provide a deeper understanding of God's redemptive plan and the significance of the genealogical accounts. Genesis chapter 11 verse 22. And Serug lived 30 years, and begat Nahor. Context: Genesis chapter 11 provides a genealogy of the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's sons. It lists the names and lifespans of several generations leading up to the birth of Abraham, who is an important figure in the biblical narrative. Serug was the son of Reu and the grandfather of Abraham. According to the genealogy presented in Genesis, Serug lived for 230 years. His name means branch or twig. Serug is mentioned in the genealogical line to highlight the lineage leading up to Abraham, who would play a significant role in God's plan for the redemption of humanity. Nahor was the son of Serug and the father of Terah. Nahor's name means snorting or snorting war horse. Though not as well known as Abraham, Nahor is mentioned because he is a part of the genealogical line through which the covenant promises of God would continue to be fulfilled. Genealogies in Scripture. Genealogies serve multiple purposes in the Bible. They provide historical records and help establish lineage and ancestry. They are also used to trace the fulfillment of God's promises or to highlight significant individuals in the biblical narrative. In the case of Genesis chapter 11 verse 22, the genealogy emphasizes the continuity of God's plan leading up to Abraham. God's faithfulness. The mention of Serug and his descendants, including Nahor and eventually Abraham, underscores God's faithfulness in preserving the chosen lineage. Through these individuals, God would establish a covenant, bless the nations, and ultimately fulfill his redemptive plan by sending Jesus Christ. Lessons for us. While Genesis chapter 11 verse 22 may appear to be a simple mention of an individual in a genealogy, it reminds us of the intricate tapestry of God's plan. Every person has a role to play in God's grand scheme, and even seemingly insignificant details in Scripture can reveal important aspects of God's faithfulness and sovereignty. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 22 introduces us to Serug, who was the father of Nahor. Although a brief mention in a genealogy, it signifies the continuation of God's plan leading up to the birth of Abraham, who would become a pivotal figure in the biblical narrative. This verse reminds us of God's faithfulness and the importance of every individual in his redemptive plan. Genesis chapter 11 verse 23. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years, and begat sons and daughters. Context. Before diving into Genesis chapter 11 verse 23, it's important to understand the context. Genesis chapter 11 describes the genealogy from Shem, one of Noah's sons, to Abram, later known as Abraham. This genealogy provides a lineage of people leading up to the establishment of the nation of Israel. Serug's life. Serug was the son of Reu and the grandfather of Abraham. According to the genealogy in Genesis chapter 11, Serug lived a total of 230 years. After Serug became the father of Nahor, he continued to live for another 200 years. During this time, Serug also had other sons and daughters. Historical significance. While the verse itself may not contain significant events or details, it contributes to the genealogy recorded in Genesis. This genealogy highlights the line of people from Noah to Abraham, tracing the origins of the Hebrew people and their connection to God's plan of redemption. Spiritual lessons. God's faithfulness. The genealogy in Genesis demonstrates God's faithfulness in preserving the chosen line leading to the Messiah. Despite the numerous generations and individuals, God's plan remains intact, fulfilling his promises. Longevity. The lifespan of people mentioned in Genesis, such as Serug living for 230 years, can seem extraordinary by today's standards. These extended lifespans remind us of the early days of creation, where human life expectancy was significantly longer. It also emphasizes the reality of sin's impact on humanity, shortening our lifespans. Family and legacy. The mention of Serug having sons and daughters highlights the importance of family and the continuation of the human race. It serves as a reminder of the significance of passing on godly values and teachings to future generations. Patience and perseverance. The fact that Serug lived for 200 years after the birth of his son Nahor reminds us of the value of patience and perseverance in life. Sometimes, we may not see the fulfillment of our dreams or God's promises immediately, but we are called to trust in God's timing and remain faithful. Remember, studying a single verse in isolation may not provide the full depth and understanding of the biblical text. Exploring the broader context and comparing related passages can enhance our comprehension. Genesis chapter 11 verse 24. And Nahor lived 29 years, and begat Terah. Context. Genesis chapter 11 provides a genealogical account of the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's sons, leading up to the birth of Abram, later known as Abraham. This verse is a part of that genealogy. Nahor was the son of Serug and the grandson of Reu. He was born after the flood and was a member of the line of Shem. Nahor's name is significant because he later becomes the name of Abraham's brother. 29 years. This phrase refers to the age of Nahor when he became the father of Terah. In other words, Nahor was 29 years old when Terah was born. Begat. The term begat signifies that Nahor was the father of Terah. It emphasizes the lineage and the continuation of the family line. Significance. While this verse may seem relatively straightforward and simple, it is important within the larger context of the genealogy of Shem's descendants. It serves to establish the lineage leading up to Abram, who plays a central role in God's redemptive plan. Overall, Genesis chapter 11 verse 24 provides a concise record of Nahor's age and the birth of his son Terah, setting the stage for the subsequent events that unfold in the biblical narrative. Genesis chapter 11 verse 25. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years, and begat sons and daughters. Genesis chapter 11 verse 25 is a verse found in the genealogical account of the descendants of Shem, one of the sons of Noah. This chapter is commonly known as the Tower of Babel narrative and precedes the story of Abraham, originally named Abram. In this particular verse, Nahor, who is one of the sons of Serug and a great-grandson of Shem, is mentioned. It states that Nahor lived for 119 years after he became the father of Terah, and during that time, he had other sons and daughters. This verse, like other genealogical passages in the Bible, serves to trace the lineage and provide a historical account of the descendants leading up to significant figures. In this case, the focus is on Terah, who would become the father of Abram, later renamed Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. The genealogical accounts in the Bible often emphasize the passing down of generations and the preservation of family lines. They contribute to the overall narrative of God's redemptive plan and how he worked through specific individuals and their descendants to fulfill his purposes. While Genesis chapter 11 verse 25 might appear relatively straightforward, it is part of a larger narrative that showcases God's providence and his chosen people through whom he would bring about his plans. By exploring the subsequent chapters and the lives of Abraham and his descendants, we gain a deeper understanding of God's unfolding covenant and the eventual arrival of Jesus Christ the Messiah, who would be born through Abraham's lineage. Genesis chapter 11 verse 26. And Terah lived 70 years, and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This verse is a brief but significant part of the genealogy recorded in the book of Genesis. It introduces Terah, who is the father of three notable figures: Abram, later known as Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Terah's life is summarized as living for 70 years and then begetting his three sons. However, there is more to Terah's story and the broader context that is worth exploring. Terah's significance. Terah plays a significant role in the early history of God's people. He is the father of Abram, who later becomes the central figure in God's plan for redemption. Through Abram's descendants, the nation of Israel is established, and ultimately, Jesus Christ, the Savior, is born. The call of Abram. In the subsequent verses of Genesis, starting from chapter 12, we learn that God calls Abram out of his homeland to go to a land that he will show him. This divine call marks the beginning of God's covenant with Abram, in which God promises to bless him and make him a great nation. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 to chapter 12 verse 3. The faith of Abram. Abram's response to God's call demonstrates his faith and obedience. In Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 to chapter 11 verse 10, we find that Abram, by faith, obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Abram's journey of faith becomes an inspiring example for believers throughout history. The importance of genealogies. The genealogical records found throughout the Bible serve various purposes. They provide historical and chronological information, establish lineage, and emphasize God's faithfulness in preserving a chosen line through which his purposes are fulfilled. The genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 verse 26 sets the stage for the subsequent narrative and the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 26 introduces Terah, the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This verse sets the stage for the divine call of Abram and the beginning of God's covenant with him, marking a pivotal point in biblical history. It highlights the significance of faith and obedience in the life of Abram and emphasizes the importance of genealogies in understanding God's plan of redemption. Genesis chapter 11 verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. Context: Genesis chapter 11 gives an account of the descendants of Noah's son Shem, leading up to the story of Abram, later called Abraham, and the beginning of God's covenant with him. Terah, mentioned in this verse, was the father of Abram. Terah's family: Terah had 3 sons, Abram, later renamed Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran had a son named Lot. This verse provides a genealogical record of Terah's descendants and sets the stage for the subsequent events in the life of Abraham. The importance of genealogies. Throughout the Bible, genealogies serve several purposes. They establish lineage and family connections, provide historical records, and trace the lineage of significant individuals. In this case, the genealogy helps us track the ancestry of Abraham, who plays a crucial role in God's plan of redemption. The covenant with Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abram and makes a covenant with him, promising to bless him, make it great nation, and bless all nations through him. The covenant with Abraham sets the foundation for the Israelite nation and ultimately leads to the birth of Jesus Christ, who becomes the Savior of all mankind. Symbolism and foreshadowing. Haran, one of Terah's sons, is the father of Lot. Later in the narrative, Lot becomes a prominent figure, particularly in the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. This connection foreshadows future events and demonstrates how God's plans unfold through generations. God's sovereignty. Although this verse may seem like a simple genealogical record, it underscores God's sovereignty and his providential hand in establishing lineages and choosing individuals to carry out his purposes. God's plan to bless all nations through Abraham was set in motion through the family of Terah. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 27 introduces us to Terah, the father of Abram, later Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. This verse provides a genealogical record that sets the stage for God's covenant with Abraham, which plays a significant role in God's redemptive plan for humanity. It reminds us of God's sovereignty in choosing individuals and establishing lineages to accomplish his purposes. Genesis chapter 11 verse 28. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 28 is part of the genealogy of Terah, the father of Abraham. It provides a key piece of information about the family of Terah and sets the stage for the narrative that follows. The death of Haran. The verse states that Haran, one of the sons of Terah, died in the land of his nativity, which is Ur of the Chaldees. This brief mention of Haran's death is significant in understanding the subsequent events involving Terah and his other 2 sons, Nahor and Abram, later called Abraham. Symbolic significance. Haran's death before his father is a reminder of the mortality and transient nature of human life. It emphasizes the reality of death and serves as a reminder that life on earth is temporary. This theme of mortality is prevalent throughout the Bible and underscores the need for humanity to seek God and find purpose in him. Geographical location. The verse also highlights that Haran died in Ur of the Chaldees, which was a prominent city in ancient Mesopotamia. This geographical detail adds context to the subsequent events, as it is in Ur that God calls Abraham to leave his homeland and go to the land that he would show him. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1-4. Foreshadowing God's call. The mention of Haran's death in Ur of the Chaldees foreshadows God's intervention in the life of Abraham and the subsequent establishment of the nation of Israel. Through the death of Haran, God sets the stage for his divine call and plan for Abraham to become the father of a great nation. Family dynamics. The death of Haran may have had an impact on Terah and his remaining sons, Nahor and Abram. It could have been a significant loss for the family and potentially influenced their subsequent decisions and actions. Lessons for believers. While this verse may seem relatively brief and straightforward, it reminds us that life is fragile and limited. It encourages us to reflect on the brevity of our own lives and the importance of living in accordance with God's purposes. It prompts us to seek God's will and embrace His calling, even when it involves leaving behind familiar places or facing challenging circumstances. As you delve deeper into the subsequent chapters of Genesis, you will find that God's plan unfolds through Abraham and his descendants, ultimately leading to the birth of the Israelite nation and the eventual coming of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Genesis chapter 11 verse 29. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 29 is part of the genealogy of Terah, the father of Abram, later called Abraham, and Nahor. It provides information about their marriages and introduces the characters of Sarai and Milcah. Importance of marriage. This verse highlights the significance of marriage in the biblical narrative. It shows that both Abram and Nahor married, indicating the continuation of their family line. Marriage is a sacred institution established by God and plays a crucial role in the unfolding of His plan throughout the Bible. Abram and Sarai. Abram, who later becomes a central figure in biblical history, is mentioned alongside his wife Sarai. Sarai's name means princess, and she becomes an important figure in the story of God's covenant with Abram, as she eventually becomes the mother of Isaac and the ancestress of the Israelite nation. Nahor and Milcah. Nahor, Abram's brother, is also mentioned along with his wife Milcah. Milcah is the daughter of Haran, Abram's deceased brother. Nahor and Milcah's descendants also play a role in the biblical narrative, as they become part of the ancestral line leading to the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Family relationships. This verse emphasizes the importance of family relationships and the interconnectedness of the characters in the Genesis narrative. It mentions Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah, who is also the brother of Abram and Nahor. Understanding these family connections helps establish the historical context and genealogy of the biblical characters. Foreshadowing God's plan. Although this verse might seem like a simple list of marriages, it is part of God's greater plan. The descendants of Abram and Nahor play significant roles in the fulfillment of God's promises to establish a great nation and bless all the nations of the earth. The mention of these marriages sets the stage for the unfolding of God's redemptive plan throughout the rest of the Bible. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 verse 29 provides valuable information about the marriages of Abram and Nahor, introducing important characters like Sarai and Milcah. It underscores the significance of marriage and family relationships in the biblical narrative while setting the stage for God's plan to unfold through these individuals and their descendants. Genesis chapter 11 verse 30. But Sarai was barren. She had no child. Context. To better understand Genesis chapter 11 verse 30, it is important to look at the broader context of the passage. Genesis chapter 11 describes the events after the flood and introduces the genealogy from Shem to Abram, later renamed Abraham. In verse 29, we learn that Abram's wife Sarai, later renamed Sarah, was barren, unable to conceive a child. Barrenness in the Bible. Barrenness was a significant issue in the biblical narrative, particularly for women, as it was seen as a curse or a sign of divine disfavor. Many prominent women in the Bible, including Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Hannah, initially faced barrenness before being blessed with children. Barrenness created a sense of longing, anguish, and vulnerability. Trusting God's promises. Sarah's barrenness played a crucial role in highlighting God's faithfulness and power. Despite the circumstances, God promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child who would become the ancestor of a great nation. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1-3, Genesis chapter 15 verse 4-5. This promise tested their faith and required them to trust in God's timing and ability to fulfill His word. Lessons in patience and faith. The story of Sarah's barrenness teaches us important lessons about patience and faith in God's promises. Sarah and Abraham had to wait many years before the birth of their son, Isaac. During this time, They faced various challenges and even made mistakes, such as when Sarah suggested that Abraham father a child with her servant Hagar. Genesis chapter 16. However, through it all, God remained faithful to his promise and eventually fulfilled it. God's power in the midst of human weakness. Sarah's barrenness also demonstrates that God's power is made perfect in human weakness. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9. By choosing a barren woman to bring forth a child, God showed his ability to work miracles and accomplish his purposes through unlikely means. This theme of God using the weak and the seemingly impossible situations runs throughout the Bible, reminding us that our limitations do not limit God. Application to our lives. The story of Sarah's barrenness encourages us to trust in God's promises, even when circumstances seem impossible. It teaches us to be patient and wait for God's timing, knowing that he is faithful to fulfill his word. It also reminds us that God can work in our weaknesses and turn our limitations into opportunities for his power to be displayed. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 30 introduces us to the barrenness of Sarai, later Sarah, and sets the stage for the story of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promise to Abraham and Sarah. It teaches us important lessons about trusting in God's promises, waiting patiently, and recognizing God's power in the midst of our weaknesses. Genesis chapter 11 verse 31. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran, and dwelt there. Context. The book of Genesis, particularly chapters 11 to 25, recounts the early history of humanity and focuses on the story of Abraham, who plays a significant role in God's plan of redemption. Genesis chapter 11 verse 31 is part of the narrative leading up to God's call and covenant with Abraham. Terah's journey. Terah, Abram's father, took Abram, Lot Abram's nephew, and Sarai Abram's wife and left Ur of the Chaldees. Ur was a prominent city in ancient Mesopotamia, known for its idolatry and polytheistic practices. It is important to note that Terah initiated this journey, although it was God who eventually called Abram to leave his family and homeland entirely. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 to 4. Purpose of the journey. The stated purpose of their journey was to go to the land of Canaan. Canaan was the promised land that God would later give to Abram and his descendants as an inheritance. Genesis chapter 12 verse 7. However, they did not reach Canaan initially. They settled in Haran, which was a city on the way to Canaan. Significance of Haran. Haran was located in modern-day southeastern Turkey, roughly halfway between Ur and Canaan. The name, Haran, means parched or dry. It is possible that they stopped there due to Terah's reluctance to continue the journey or for other reasons not explicitly mentioned in the text. Delayed journey and divine intervention. Terah's decision to halt in Haran marked a delay in God's plan for Abram to enter the Promised Land. It wasn't until after Terah's death that God specifically called Abram to continue the journey and enter the land of Canaan. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 to 4. Lessons from Genesis chapter 11 verse 31. This verse highlights several important themes in the biblical narrative. It shows that God's plans are not always carried out immediately, and there may be delays and detours along the way. It also demonstrates that God can work through imperfect individuals and circumstances to accomplish his purposes. In this case, God's plan to establish a covenant with Abram and his descendants was not thwarted by the delay in Haran. Application. As believers, we can draw encouragement from this passage. Sometimes, God's plans for our lives may not unfold in the way we expect or according to our preferred timeline. We may face delays, obstacles, or periods of waiting. However, we can trust that God is still in control, and he can use even the detours and delays for our ultimate good and his glory. We should remain faithful, obedient, and willing to follow God's leading, even when the path seems unclear or different from what we initially anticipated. Remember, studying the Bible is a continuous process, and it's beneficial to explore various commentaries, seek guidance from pastors or spiritual leaders, and engage in personal reflection to gain a deeper understanding of God's Word. Genesis chapter 11 verse 32. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Context: Genesis chapter 11 verse 32 is part of the genealogical account in the book of Genesis that traces the lineage from Noah to Abraham. This verse concludes the narrative of Terah, who was the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Terah's life is summarized by stating that he lived for 205 years and died in Haran. The significance of the lifespan: Terah's lifespan of 205 years was relatively long compared to those who came after him. In the earlier chapters of Genesis, we see that people lived for several hundred years. The decreasing lifespan after the flood was a consequence of the curse of sin, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 verse 3. Terah's long life highlights the transition from the longer lifespans of the pre-flood era to the shorter lifespans of the post-flood era. Terah's role in biblical history: Terah is an important figure in biblical history as the father of Abraham, who played a pivotal role in God's plan for salvation and the establishment of the Israelite nation. However, Terah himself did not receive the same level of prominence as his son. Terah is mainly mentioned in connection with Abraham's journey from Ur to the land of Canaan. It is likely that Terah intended to settle in Canaan, but instead, he stopped in Haran, where he eventually died. This pause in Terah's journey paved the way for God to call Abraham to continue the journey and fulfill his purposes. Symbolism of Haran: Haran is mentioned as the place where Terah died. Symbolically, Haran represents a place of delay or stopping short of the fullness of God's promise. Terah's death in Haran can be seen as a reminder that sometimes we may face obstacles or distractions that hinder us from fully embracing God's plans for our lives. It serves as a lesson to keep pressing forward in faith and obedience, not settling for less than what God has called us to. Application: Terah's story prompts us to reflect on our own spiritual journey. Are there areas in our lives where we have settled for less or allowed distractions to hinder us from fully following God's calling? It encourages us to examine our hearts and evaluate whether we are faithfully pursuing God's will, even when faced with obstacles. It reminds us to be mindful of the impact our decisions can have on future generations and to seek God's guidance as we navigate our own journeys. In summary, Genesis chapter 11 verse 32 provides a brief account of Terah's life and his death in Haran. While Terah's role may seem relatively minor, his story carries symbolic significance and important lessons for our own spiritual journeys.